It is Sunday afternoon, October 19th, 1947, in Lime Rock, Connecticut, in the office of Alfred Korzybski. He is now talking with Kenneth Keyes on difficulties in learning to apply general semantics.
I can do no better than to read to you the famous bequest of Professor Pavlov to the academic youth of his country. The important part of the lecture is that what Pavlov said is really, it applies to everyday life, not only science. He's speaking about character development which helps any kind of achievement in any field. Would it be family life, national or international fields? The same bequest could be given to the rest of the world, not only the youth of his country. Here follows Pavlov's bequest. What can I wish to the youth of my country who devote themselves to science? Firstly, gradualness, about the most important condition of fruitful scientific work. I never can speak without emotion. Gradualness, and gradualness. From the very beginning of your work, school yourself to severe gradualness in the accumulation of knowledge. Learn the ABC of science before you try to ascend to its summit, never behind. Begin to subsequent without mastering the preceding. Never attempt to screen an insufficiency of knowledge, even by the most audacious surmise and hypothesis. Howsoever this soap bubble will rejoice your eyes by its play, it inevitably will burst, and you will have nothing except shame. School yourself to demureness and patience. Learn to inure yourself to drudgery in science. Learn, compare, collect the facts. Perfect as is the wing of a bird, I never could raise the bird up without resting on air. Facts are the air of a scientist. Without them, you never can fly. Without them, your theories are vain efforts. But learning, experimenting, observing, trying not to stay on the surface of facts. Do not become the archivist of facts. Try to penetrate to the secret of their occurrence. Persistently search for the laws which govern them. Secondly, modesty. Never think that you already know all. However highly you are appraised, always have the courage to say of yourself, I am ignorant. Do not allow haughtiness to take you in possession. Due to that, you will be obstinate where it is necessary to agree. You will refuse useful advice and friendly help. You will lose the standard of objectiveness. Thirdly, passion. Remember that science demands from a man all his life. If you had 2 lives, that would be not enough for you. Be passionate if you work at your searchings. I began with the quotation from Pavlov. That great man knew the difficulties of learning and scientific work, and his advice is applicable to life for the simple reason that we have to keep that gradualness in adjustment, whether it will be with parents or children, or husband or wife. Every human relationship, national or international, requires adjustment to each other. And this follows, and the difficulties follow, the disregard which we, as a rule, pay to the great words of a great man. In our case, in training in general semantics, we are up against tremendous difficulties which are ingrained in us and canalized, so to say, in our nervous system by the old way of so-called thinking, our whole system of education, our whole traditions, and the way scientific men think, the way mathematicians think, physiologists think. Pavlov, among others, applied to himself what he gave as a big quest to his students and his nation. He applied it, and because of that, he made one of the most tremendous achievements in history. Not long before he died, after he achieved most of his experimenting on animals, in particular dogs, he got more and more interested in the reaction of humans. And he began to study and read and think about the application of his work to human beings. It became obvious through his experimenting, as explained in my Science of Sanity, that the change of space-time intervals, and so on, interplay with them on a living organism could drive even a dog, neurotic or even psychotic, which was ultimately, he became rather incurable. He could not miss, ultimately, the benefit and the consequences of his own work. He couldn't help to notice what happens to the dogs. Later, some of his students began to experiment on animals from a human point of view, trying to produce experimental neurological disturbances in animals. And today they have experiments made on dogs, on cats, on rats, on pigs, goats, sheep, and whatnot. On the bottom of those sick reactions, we find frustration. surprise, maximum expectation with minimum results, which ends ultimately in frustration, and the etc., and the given animal then becomes obviously neurotic or psychotic. Some are curable, some are not. All depends of the matters of treatment by a human being. Those experimental neuroses are most fundamental for psychiatrists, because when we deal with higher animals and make them neurotic or psychotic deliberately, through frustration, experimental, frustrating an expectation, etc., we witness a complete breakdown which goes parallel to human breakdowns. The human values of those experiments are such that we learn how to produce psychosis or neurosis, and then we see the deadly parallel with us, with ourselves. And therefore, we should not have, for instance, maximum expectation, because facts will not cover maximum expectation. The pet of our parents and teachers, they teach us maximum expectation. Life facts do not follow the maximum expectation. The result is frustration, cynicism, bitterness, etc., with the result that breakdowns happen. When we learn how to produce experimental neuroses in animals and analyze the situation from a comparative psychological point of view, we learn for ourselves, on our human level, what to avoid, what not to do to remain sane. All of that has naturally very solid experimental foundation, physiological, neurophysiological, and they actually follow the work of Pavlov. Today in every country, and particularly in the United States, every psychological laboratory is dealing with studying the manifestation of animals which have been made ill, so to say, in quotation marks, of course, mentally ill. We learn what not to do. We learn how to educate. We learn how to treat children. And an endless array of purely human wisdom which we learned about. Psychiatrists today fully realize that comparatively few people who break down are due to the, what we may say, poor protoplasm. Much more troubles happen through environmental factors than mere poor protoplasm. As living protoplasm is electrocolloidal in character, and different feelings, thinking, premises, assumption, hypotheses involve electrocolloidal manifestation. We can see to what extent it is possible and actual. Psychiatrists know very well that the environmental factors grow all the time in importance. Psychosomatic medicine today, for instance, has transformed completely medical knowledge to the point that so many new factors enter which follow exponential laws with accelerated acceleration. They follow chain indexes. From some little messes, some worse messes happen. And so it goes indefinitely. Naturally, the understanding of the structure of those mechanisms, all of which are electrocolloidal, ultimately, the rest follows. We learn what not to do, how to behave. As all so-called feelings, thinking, and whatnot, are actually on the silent level. They are not verbal. So identification of verbal levels with the silent levels must be a very serious mistake, sometimes fatal mistake. All those theories, assumption, hypothesis, and whatnot involves special electrocolloidal configuration, and therefore they affect the whole well-being of the human being. And today, with the new outlook, which is fundamentally difficult to get, every physician probably knows more about electrocolloids. I would rather say that most physicians have more forgotten about their courses in electrocolloids than I ever knew. In the meantime, they are unable to think electrocolloidally. They still think in terms of such higher abstraction, man-made artifacts like organs, for the simple reason that to think electrocolloidally, we must have the infinite valued orientation, because the configuration, electrocolloidal configuration, may change indefinitely in terms of degree, in terms of frequency, in the terms, so to say, of configuration. And this, to change that, is an extremely difficult field. One of the main benefits, if you wish, of general semantics is exactly the point that he gives us a new way of thinking. And that assumes the possibilities of perfectly unforeseeable consequences. Those issues sound so very innocent when spoken about. They are not so when applied. They are very difficult to recanalize our nervous systems to be able to acquire the new orientation. To give you a standard example of what happens with even my students, I will give you a case of migraine. A young fellow, about 25, a university student, had a migraine, very severe migraine, all his life since childhood. He was very much of a wreck because of it. He tried everything, standard, means medical standard stuff, every kind of drugs. It didn't help. As you know, I am not a medical man, and I have nothing to do with migraine as such. when I was lecturing, of course I didn't mention a migraine or anything of this sort. I just carried on the seminar. In the middle of it, the migraine of the fellow just disappeared. When I saw him after the seminar, he told me this. Of course, I was very happy. It was a very definite positive result, and we parted quite happily with that definite improvement. Some months later, the fellow came to see me. He just dropped in for a little visit. I asked him, how is his migraine? The answer was sort of bitter, frustrated, oh, as bad as ever. Well, I asked him then, you persist still working at extensionalization? He said, no, quite happily. And not being a medical man, fortunately, I told him, oh, you don't work. I hope you get a better migraine. MD could not do that. I'm glad I am not a doctor, because you couldn't say that to a patient. He was not my patient, he was my student, that's all. Well, apparently, this got under his skin. He began to work, and worked steadily at what he learned in his seminar, to recanalize his nervous system. The result was that again, after, I don't know, months, if not a year of work, steady application of GS. Finally, the migraine disappeared, and the last time I saw him, he had no migraine for about 4 years. And I have to draw your attention that I treated him with general semantics pure and simple. Nothing medical was done. Yet the results were quite obvious. And of course, this was a complete reconstruction in his life, because a fellow who has a permanent migraine, naturally he's not fit to work, not fit to learn, not fit for anything. So this was an extremely serious problem. I give you that migraine problem for the simple reason that all of you know about migraine, and it is a very severe affair on one side, and the other side, well, it's very common, and we know it. Dealing with more complex problems, we also have records, because my students write how they struggle occasionally to get GS, what I call, into their guts. And those who do really work for months, if not years, then the results follow automatically. We see we have included in the environment, not only the environment outside of our skin, but the environment inside of our skin, which means our feelings, our pain, pleasure, our thinking, every kind of our feelings. They are all what may be said on the same level as the happenings outside of our skin, because they are not verbal. And then we can see also that theories, plain and simple, myths, zoological outlooks, or mythological outlooks, they also involve electrocolloidal configuration in the brain, and therefore they may produce lasting negative results. In our work, what we do, we eliminate, so to say, the old theoretical sick electrocolloidal configuration in our brain, and what happens, happens, provided the student keeps working. In our work, we give the student means how to help himself. This is in many ways a novelty. Usually, in the childhood of humanity, we are looking for somebody to do something for us. But in the old days, we didn't give anybody means, methods, which ultimately are electrocolloidal in character, how to transform their electrocolloidal configuration to the point that altering the internal environment, the adjustment to the external environment becomes more tolerable and in general better. Now, to do that change of electrocolloidal configuration is a very difficult job, genuinely difficult. It sounds simple. My students know how simple, ultimately, the methods of general semantics are. Common sense. We can convey them even to small children. And yet, the application is so difficult. Why those difficulties occur is again due to electrocolloidal canalization, nervous canalization, which means that a nerve impulse, and please remember that when I speak about fibers, what I say is wrong. I have no business talking about fibers in GS. In the meantime, I cannot speak any better because the electrocolloidal mechanisms are known to exist. There is no doubt about that. But we do not know what to do and how to change them. Now here we give you methods how to recanalize yourself. And those methods are, as I say, extremely simple, but very difficult in application. In my work, I am dealing with mature people. I don't deal with children. Children have no difficulties about that, but grown-up do have, for the simple reason that they have been canalized through their old outlooks which they inherited from nursery or from school. And to recanalize a nervous system, like to change a habit, it's extremely difficult. So we are in the roots of old habits, which again follow the old canalization, and therefore we have to recanalize ourselves if we want to progress. But this requires work, and we have to follow once more the advice of Pavlov. Stop. Here we must recall the minimum of the structure and function of the nervous system, namely the function of the cortical levels and the thalamic levels. They differ in the sense that what we call intellectual, pure and simple, of course in quotation marks, as well as the verbal side, is cortical. How to handle that problem? Facts show that cortical understanding of anything is not good enough, because our living reaction happen to be on the silent levels, which are predominantly thalamic. And we live outside and inside our skin on silent levels. Those are living reactions. In the meantime, great many people, if not the majority, who read or are capable of reading a heavy book, they fancy that when they understood, in quotation marks, something, they got it. It's definitely not so. We have to get something of our understanding. It means we have to convey the undivided emotion and intellect. If you divide them, you will never get what you have understood. It is pathetic, but I deal with that problem every day. Great many people say, oh, I read the book, fine. I understood everything, fine. Do you ever apply? No. And as a matter of fact, living reaction should be sort of automatic if they are acquired thalamically. It becomes a part of our nature, and then we react with it. So this is one of the very fundamental things that just the understanding, cortical, will not do. We have to begin to live with those new orientation, which are simple but difficult to get. There is another very serious problem about writers and readers. The writers usually, unless they are profoundly scientific in the sense of Pavlov, they usually, writing on a subject, they try to translate it in their own way, instead of trying to get themselves what the other fellow, not what he said, but what he wanted to say. Leibniz himself was emphasizing this, and it is deeply true. So that transcribing, so to say, of such a work as a non-Aristotelian system into the old Aristotelian ways is paralyzing the whole benefits, and therefore practically useless. For instance, I can give you great many examples, but I can give you just one example. I knew several men like that of real importance and real achievement. They were fighting the habit of additivity. And one of them said that human reactions are not algebraic sums of reflexes and so on. He's fighting against the plus. But then he says, what matters is that human reactions are conditioned by heredity plus environment. So you see the habit of speech. He's fighting the plus all through his life work. And when he wants to say something deeper to habit of speech he has to say plus so and so. And this is so incredibly common that people realize the lack of additivity in nature, and yet through habit of speech they burst into additivity plus so and so. There is no limit to examples of this. You can catch yourself every day and the same problem, that you impose on nature additivity when in nature, outside our skin and inside our skin, reactions are on the process character, and therefore they are not additive but functional. I speak here functional in the mathematical sense. Those issues are becoming today quite clear scientifically, except we have not learned how to apply that wisdom. And I am quite certain today, after years of experience, that we cannot apply the wisdom we got for the simple reason that no method or techniques were given in the old Aristotelian world. Linguistic difficulties are, as a rule, never understood. Language in the human sense happen as one of the last stages of evolution. It is the last stage of evolution. In the meantime, it is the most important in one way and the most complex, in fact, as complex as human life. I must stress again that we are living our actual life on silent levels inside and outside of our skins. It's the living mechanism. In the meantime, we have also verbal function, and it seems that the verbal functions, so to say, the role of the verbal function is which make the so-called time-binding capacity capable to operate. Time-binding, as you know, is a term which I applied to the functioning of the human nervous system, that we can transmit from individual to individual and from generation to generation the achievements of the past. It means we human beings say the fellow is 40 or 50, is no more 40 or 50 being a human being, that he is 4 or 5 million years old. Because the experiences which were on silent levels of the past could have been transmitted, and in many instances have been transmitted from generation to generation. That's the character of time binding. That definition, so to say, or even that expression, is quite obvious. There is no argument about this. The problem now is to investigate the mechanism of time binding. Well, that's what general semantics has done. Leibniz, the great mathematician, co-inventor of the calculus, differential calculus, with Newton, advised his readers and hearers that they should look not only what the writer says, but also look what the writer wanted to say. he, being a mathematician, realized fully that it is practically impossible to actually state verbally, short of a mathematical formula, which in a limited way says most of what has to be said. But writing in the ordinary language is extremely difficult to say what we want to say. And the attentive reader or student who really wants to learn must look behind the words, reconstruct, so to say, the map territory relation, visualize the territory, be it outside of his skin or inside of his skin, and then only contemplate what can be said about the silent level to give a picture, in this case verbal, of the structure of what was going on the silent levels in his head. That's the advice of the great Leibniz. One of the tremendous difficulties is again that because of that real problem, linguistic problem, writers are not conscious of it. They may read, say, a book, say, My Science and Sanity. They may read it. They read into it what isn't there. They are reading their own nervous canalization into the ordinary language of Science and Sanity. Ordinary language. There's nothing special there. The vocabulary, so to say, is common English, except it is not familiar. We are sometimes shocked if we can speak about our most intimate psychological reaction in terms of indexes, dates, etc., quotes, and hyphens. The fact that it can be done is immediately a very genuine advance, for the simple reason that when we use the devices, we are tickling, so to say, the thalamic region which cannot be reached by words. To our best knowledge, and it may not be exactly true, we don't know. I say we don't know. I know what is in print, I know my observation, but it does not mean that what I will say must be correct. I sort of am dubious myself about it, namely that linguistic centers, nervous centers, are in the cortex. I use the expression predominantly cortical region. Remember that expression, predominantly cortical region. And the so-called feelings, emotion, pain, pleasure, senses are predominantly reaction of the predominantly thalamic region. Now, in changing the structure of language, say, for instance, the subject-predicate, which has been completely abandoned in science, we have to use a language of different structure as given with the extensional devices, which involve thalamic factors, without involving linguistic centers. But the cortical linguistic production, if expressed differently as to structure, as we do in GS, they have thalamic components, and these thalamic components give the feel of what was said, and so help the thalamic reaction to become organismal. And as we live predominantly with the thalamus, one of the first things of intercommunication between human beings must be a language of such structure which would involve thalamic factors, so that we could get not only the words as words and play on words, but we could get the feel what was wanted to convey. Writers are not aware of that. They, for instance, try in their writings on GS, they try to translate our kind of language, extensional, into the old and intentional. The result is complete misunderstanding, mystification, if not giving misinformation. The old psychological terminology, as far as living is concerned, actual living organism reaction, are practically obsolete. Children, by the way, are born extensional. We ruin them by training them by intention. And the world is unfortunately not aware of that. One of my advices is definite. If the language you learned means the application of the devices to the old language. That's all. Apply the devices to the old language, and you have transformed an intentional language, by definition, into an extensional language of facts. As extensional facts, silent levels, are in an indefinite number of occurrences, indefinite. And we have only a very comparatively small amount of words of intentional character, even of words defining words and so on, disregarding completely undefined terms, which are only labels for the silent levels. We still try to play with every kind of theories of meaning. Well, no theory of meaning as yet, outside of mathematics, took into account undefined terms. And undefined terms are only labels for silent levels. And our business is to discover the facts, how the verbal forms of expression occur to be similar or dissimilar with the observation of silent levels. The majority of writers on any subject, and particularly in so-called popularization, definitely add their own biases, very often in science even, nursery training, if they try to write or speak, so to say, popularly about scientific problems who do not follow that particular structure of language. Now, so far, this concerns the writers. They misinform public very often. Curiously enough, to me, it's a joke, really. Here Einstein produced his famous Einstein theory. Then it was all strictly mathematical, equation, equation, equation. Of course, a layman could not possibly understand it, and it was useless to him. So Einstein's theory remained a mystery for many years. So finally, under the pressure of demand, he produced a famous book, too, on the theory of relativity, Einstein himself. There were very few equations there. All was explained by words. The result was that Einstein planted errors in his own book, which did not exist in his mathematical treatment. It did exist in his popularization. And of all jokes, that a philosopher, Bergson, had to pick the errors of Einstein the mathematician. And in the revision of the text, I believe, I'm quite sure, that Einstein corrected those glaring errors. In the meantime, in daily life, to convey, for instance, your observation of anything you have observed. But please remember that you give me your personal verbal reaction to your experiences or observation which you have observed on the silent level. How to convey that? If you and I, means applies to everybody, both of us are extensionalized and apply the devices permanently. On silent levels, we are trained that way because we got the devices and the thalamus and the living part of the so-called brain. Then we will ultimately understand each other. I am not certain at all, but the world situation today appears to me, from a political point of view, United Nations business, etc., as thoroughly hopeless. Thoroughly hopeless. For the simple reason that people cannot understand each other. One of the greatest achievements, certainly unhumanly ingenious, was the Tower of Babel, where the Almighty came down to confuse the tongues, because those vermin tried to get at the secrets of heaven, and so the Almighty. It was a very nice gesture of the Almighty. It showed how fair he was toward that poor vermin called